Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm David Foster. The conflict in Syria has caused the world's worst refugee crisis in 20 years. Families have been torn apart, entire communities have been ruined, and schools and hospitals have been destroyed. A conflict which has gone on for more than 2 years has killed at least 100,000 people. 6.5 million Syrians are internally displaced. The UN Refugee Agency estimates there are more than 2 million Syrians who fled from their homeland. This number takes into account registered refugees and those awaiting registrations. Let's break it down a bit. In Lebanon, almost 830,000 refugees have refugee status or are in the process of obtaining it. More than 559,000 Syrians have escaped to Jordan and are known to the authorities there, while more than 522,000 are known to have fled to Turkey. Another 207,000 refugees have registered in Iraq, and in Egypt, more than 128,000 have registered with the UN. Another 17,000 refugees have registered in the rest of North Africa. We will be hearing from our correspondents in Lebanon and Iraq, but first here's Al Jazeera's Nisrin El Shamaili at the Zatari refugee camp along the Syrian-Jordanian border.
For 18 months, the refugees here have weathered scorching heat, sandstorms and even snowstorms. Their only shelter, a plastic tent. Another freezing winter is coming, so for Ziad al-Faouri and his family, these new trailers couldn't arrive soon enough.
Rain causes flooding everywhere here. Last year, tents collapsed on people and floated around with their belongings. I cannot describe our suffering.
The people who have been here longest are the first to get a trailer. There's always a lot of frustration when they are given out. But there are now strict rules to prevent people who get a trailer from taking advantage of their good fortune. In the past, refugees who left Zatari camp to live in host communities would sell their trailers for hundreds of dollars to those living in tents. Now refugees have to sign contracts promising they won't trade camp property. This man says he's been in the camp for a year. The aid worker answers those getting trailer replacements now have been living in tents for a year and a half. Each one of these trailers costs $2,500, and replacing tents has so far cost $35 million. But there are thousands who are still waiting for a trailer. Around 3,000 families still live in tents like these. The UN Refugee Agency says the hope is to replace all the tents with trailers by January, before the weather becomes unbearably cold. Refugees are also getting thermal blankets before the winter sets in and temperatures fall below zero. Winter clothing and shoes are given to the most vulnerable, children under the age of 5. But there's not enough money to provide everything they need, so conditions in the camp remain difficult.
I don't think that we all were prepared for the crisis to last so much longer. So it took many of the donors, not by surprise, but it took many of the donors sort of saying, well, let me go and look if I have more money available.
These refugees have no idea when they'll be able to return to their country. If the promised funding isn't delivered, they could suffer here for many more summers and winters. Nisrin El Shamaili for Inside Syria, a Zatari camp.
Imran Khan is in one of the Syrian refugee camps in northern Iraq.
Walking through the mud of this camp is a difficult business now. I was here when this place was set up just a few months ago, and I have to say things have improved dramatically. All of the aid agencies, and that includes the UN, have made a big effort. There are schools here for children. There are also shops that have been set up. There's an informal economy going on. However, it doesn't really matter, almost, what goes on in this camp. The one thing these people want is the one thing the aid agencies can't give them, and that's a safe return back to Syria. So here they wait, and they are making the best of a very bad situation. You have a look over there, they're making bread. You see these social areas. There are even shops, like I said. But UNHCR face a funding crisis. They say they need more money and winter is coming. Now, to use a technical term, this camp needs to be winterized. So the residents need warm clothing and these tents need to be made waterproof. with that funding crisis, that's going to be very, very difficult. So one thing is absolutely clear. This camp faces an incredibly tough winter.
So what has been the human cost of a conflict which is now in its 30th month and with no end in sight? Joining me from Beirut, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Welcome to the programme.
It's a pleasure.
It's very difficult to have a yardstick by which to compare one crisis with another, but how bad do you believe the refugee crisis is for the Syrian people?
Well, if you compare with other situations in the past, this is the biggest refugee crisis since the genocide in Rwanda. And if it goes on and on and on, like it has been in the past few months, it risks to become the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. And I mean, the numbers are not what matter. What matter is the suffering of each individual person. Be it a refugee outside the country, be it a person displaced inside Syria, or someone trapped by the conflict in their own village or in their own city. The level of human suffering that I'm witnessing with the Syria crisis is indeed without parallel with anything else I've witnessed in my own life.
And in fact, you have just come back from one refugee camp. I know that you've been to several others in recent weeks. When you were there, what did you see? What stories really moved you?
Well, I came from Arsal. Arsal is a city in the Bekaa Valley, close to the border with Syria and close to the area where, in the mountains, fighting is now taking place. I met people that had come from 10 days before, and their testimony was, of course, houses destroyed, members of their family being killed, and fear, and the need to escape, the need to flee, to be able to survive. Indeed, what also, to be honest, produced a very strong impression in me was the generosity of the Lebanese people. Arsal is a city with 35,000 people. There are now more than 40,000 Syrian refugees. The majority of them is in houses of the Lebanese, others in houses semi-built, and a few in camps that we are creating at the present moment in order to be able to accommodate everybody. People are still coming as the fighting is going on. But the generosity of the Lebanese people. Now, 25% of the population in Lebanon is Syrian. Of these Syrians, 800,000 are registered as refugees in the UNHRC. The equivalent of that in the United States would be 56 million refugees coming into the US. So the impact in the Lebanese economy, the Lebanese society, the Lebanese security is huge. And this country has shown an enormous generosity, and to be honest, the international community has to a large extent abandoned it. And Jordan is making a similar effort. Turkey has spent billions of dollars supporting the refugees from Syria. In Iraq, we can imagine how this pressure from Syria is impacting in a country that is in itself with lots of violence and lots of problems. So indeed, this is becoming a regional crisis, a crisis that risks an explosion in the Middle East if it is not stopped. To stop this war is essential, because the amount of suffering I'm witnessing and the risks of spillover of the conflict make it really an extremely dramatic situation with an enormous danger for the global peace and security.
So these people have, in your opinion, and this isn't the first time I've heard you say it, been abandoned by the international community. Is that because the international community doesn't care, or it can't afford to, such is the scale of the problem?
I think that the question is a question of all the support that has been provided is out of proportion with the needs of the refugees themselves and with the problems that are being faced by the host countries. The impact here in Lebanon, in the school system, in the health system, in infrastructure. In Jordan, that is a country always with lack of water. This massive increase of population is causing enormous problems. Now, the capacity of the international community to help these countries cope with this challenge and to give the refugees an adequate answer to their needs and to their rights, that capacity is far from being there. And of course, even if a lot of support has been mobilized, it's out of proportion with the real needs we face on the ground.
We're going to get into some specifics about how this could possibly change in just a moment. But right now, Mr. Guterres, we're going to address the plight of the most vulnerable. The Syrian war is robbing hundreds of thousands of children of a chance to learn, a chance to grow in the best possible way. The United Nations has released these figures. More than half of the 2.2 million registered Syrian refugees are children. Lebanon has almost 400,000 child refugees. A staggering 80% of them are not at school. Jordan's taken in almost 300,000 children from Syria. 56% of them are not at school. Even in the country that has given them a new home, Syrian refugee children aren't safe. Many are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse because they have to work to provide for their families, and they're missing out on an education. Al Jazeera's Zaina Hoda reports from Beirut.
Alia is 11 years old. She escaped the war in Syria only to find herself facing a new danger in Lebanon. Her school is safe, but like her, many of these refugees also have to work once classes are over.
A man in a car with a Syrian plate number approached me. He looked scary and he asked to buy some flowers. As I was handing him the flowers, he grabbed my arm. I ran inside the supermarket. He waited and then followed us. We ran away.
Because of that, Alia no longer works on the streets, but her 9-year-old brother Muhammad has no choice. Their mother is a cleaner, but her salary just isn't enough for them to survive. So every afternoon, Muhammad sells flowers on the streets of Beirut. More and more children are being forced to work.
As families' resources become more depleted, children are sent out to work, some in very difficult circumstances and unsafe conditions.
You can see the problem in almost every street corner in Lebanon. These children live a difficult and dangerous life. They are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and many of them are worn down emotionally.
These children are traumatized from what they saw in Syria. They are scared to reveal their identities, even though it has been almost a year since they fled the violence.
We were in a bus and there was a checkpoint. We saw someone kill everyone right in front of us. I saw the way they all died.
Those images are still clear in their minds, and social workers say there are many other children who are not getting the help they need. They also face risks here in Lebanon.
They are traumatized from the violence in Syria and in Lebanon. Some face sexual abuse in crowded areas where refugees stay.
Just by talking to these children, you realize how the war has impacted their lives.
The war won't stop because people are killing each other, and then people will take revenge. If one man loses a brother, he will later kill the one responsible.
At the age of 10, this boy has an adult understanding of his country's tragedy. I am disturbed and frustrated, he says. He is among those who the United Nations calls a generation of innocents who are in danger of becoming lasting casualties of an appalling war. Zaina Hoda for Inside Syria.
Let us resume our conversation with Antonio Guterres, who's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In a report, Commissioner, you say the scars of the children appear as a loss of speech, broken sleep, challenging behaviour, and many are becoming angry at their plight, which is dangerous for the region. The consequences of this could be felt for years, if not generations, to come.
Indeed, it is true. This research that was conducted by UNHCR, the most dramatic aspect of it, it's not the statistics, it's not the appalling numbers, it's the individual tragedy of each child, and especially of those that are traumatized by violence. I met children that had lost one of their parents. I met children that had seen their houses destroyed. I was in Zatri in one of the tents with a family for about 15-20 minutes, And their young boy, 4 years old, was compulsively shooting with a toy gun, and the parents did everything they could to stop him, but it was impossible because the violence was inside him. You go to schools where Syrian refugees are, and you see that their drawings are mostly of houses being bombed or people being killed or bodies on the ground. And this trauma by violence, knowing that even if together with our partners we are doing our best to provide psychosocial support, what we are doing is out of proportion with the needs. This trauma by violence is the biggest threat, because it's a threat for the rest of their lives, and it's a threat for the future of Syria.
And you also talk about forced marriages because they need to get rid of a dependent, young girls being forced into that situation. We saw there the children having to work, being left alone, their parents are dead, and they then have to become the breadwinner for younger brothers and sisters. And at the end of that, you write, the needs are growing faster than our capacity to respond to the plight of all of these children. It's going to get worse.
Indeed. Child labor is unfortunately very frequent. Girls driven into prostitution by their families is less frequent, but it happens, and it's a tragedy that, I mean, one can imagine what these girls will think in the rest of their lives, even about their families. Sexual harassment is another danger that is everywhere possible, and indeed, as the war goes on, as those that are in exile are for a longer and longer period and have exhausted their savings, their resources, the situation will get worse, the needs increase, and the capacity to respond will not be able to match that increase in needs. That's why we are appealing to the international community to massively increase their support in order for a program to be possible with 3 key objectives. Bring all the children, the Syrian children, to school, increase massively psychosocial support to those traumatized by violence, and at the same time create effective mechanisms of protection, namely through the support, the financial support to the vulnerable families, in order to avoid the violation of human rights of children that have been described in the film. And this will be a program. UNICEF is very strongly engaged in it, together with us and many other agencies, and the program is called No Lost Generation. We need to avoid that this generation of Syrian children becomes a lost generation. That would be a tragedy for themselves and a tragedy for the country itself.
The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has an annual budget of over $4 billion. It has to come from somewhere. When this crisis is unfolding in the Middle East, are you surprised that the richer countries in this region are not being more generous?
I think it's important to underline that the countries of the region all have strong humanitarian budgets, but only Kuwait used its humanitarian budget to support the multilateral institutions, the UN agencies, the international NGOs, in a very important contribution for what we are doing in the region. Most of the other countries in the Gulf have their own strategies. They support their own entities. That, of course, doesn't mean that there is not a lot of humanitarian aid being provided. What it is sometimes difficult is to coordinate things and to make sure that we really address the most pressing needs of the most vulnerable people.
But could they not be more generous on that side as well, when the latest figures I was able to read show that the Syrian regional refugee response internationally is to date less than 40% funded? That means they've still got to give you 60% of what they promised, now hasn't come.
Those numbers have improved. Fortunately, we are now slightly above 60%, but indeed there's still a lot that is needed. And, you know, generosity is not proportional to richness. The biggest examples of generosity I've witnessed are of the poor people. And today I've seen them again here in Lebanon, in the city of Arsal. It is the most poor people that is normally more generous. A colleague of mine has seen a woman with 6 children. She asked that woman, that Syrian woman, are they your children? And they said, no, their parents were killed. I adopted them. Now, this is the proof that even when people are extremely poor, even when people are extremely deprived, they can be very generous. Unfortunately, sometimes the richest people and the richest countries are not as generous as the poor ones.
Which brings me to a phrase that I hadn't known until I was reading up about this subject, which is called refugee warehousing. Where refugees are put into places which are not supposed to be permanent, tented camps, and yet have to stay there for years. How do you end something like that, which restores people's pride, it gives their children something to hold on to, and perhaps a future to look forward to, if you put them in somewhere where their self-respect can come back?
Well, first of all, we don't like camps. We only use camps when governments consider that that is the policy that needs to be adopted for them to accept refugees, or when there is no other alternative. It is always preferable for the refugees to be in the community and to be received by the community when the community has the capacity to do so. Not to be warehoused, as you were saying, but to have a life as close as possible to a normal life, like all the citizens of the country where they are. But it is not always possible. On the other hand, what is essential is to find solutions. To find solutions, first of all, by ending conflict and allowing people to go back home in safety and dignity, as it has happened, fortunately, to many. Last year we helped about 500,000 people go back home around the world to their countries of origin. But another solution is to integrate in the countries of asylum when they have the capacity to do so. And for instance, Tanzania has naturalized more than 170,000 Burundians that have been there since '72. Resettlement into countries in the developed world is another solution. We are resettling about 80,000 per year to start a new life in North America, in Europe, in Australia, in Latin America. But unfortunately, 70% of the world's refugees are refugees in a protracted situation. They have been refugees for more than 5 years. And this indeed is what makes their tragedy more dramatic. And when you are, for instance, like in Dadaab in Kenya, Somalis that their grandparents came to Dadaab, they had their children there, and now those children have new children for more than 20 years in the camp. Those situations are really something that break our heart and something that we should be able to stop. But for that, we need to stop the wars that are still going on in the present world.
You have an invaluable job, an extremely important one, and yet it's a desperate one, isn't it? We're talking about 23,000 new refugees every single day.
It is a motive for desperation, but then when we see the courage of these people, the resilience they show, their generosity, their dignity, we feel very proud to be able to do this kind of job. And we feel very happy that we have the opportunity to work with these unknown heroes that have suffered so much, but have been able to preserve their hope in the future and their dignity as human beings.
A final word, Commissioner, not just on the refugees, but those who work for you, with you, to try and help them. How do you keep their spirits up?
I must say that I found in this organization, and I believe the same in all other humanitarian organizations, an enormous generosity in the people that work with me. And it's a dangerous job. Humanitarian action became a dangerous business. We have had a number of people dying, and unfortunately, we had more people dying in their job since the beginning of the century than in the whole story of UNHCR from the Second World War. This demonstrates that conflicts are becoming more unpredictable, with more actors. Some of those actors do not respect any rules. We see armies, national and international. We see militias, ethnic, political, religious militias. We see bandits. And in many of these scenarios, unfortunately, the humanitarian work is not respected. The UN flag or even the Red Cross flag are not respected. And to work to support those that are in these very difficult conditions became very, very dangerous.
Well, many thanks for coming on this edition of Inside Syria. That was Antonio Guterres, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And that is it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this programme, but with our hourly news programmes and, of course, online at aljazeera.com. Thank you for watching Inside Syria. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Goodbye for now.